Chapter 10. "Where is this alleged cat?" Nick asked on his third morning waking up in the Salvram household. He shivered and bundled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. He'd just come back into the kitchen after a morning's smoke. Having to go out onto the frost-rimmed patio to light up was definitely starting to work as a deterrent. Vash poured a mug of black coffee and passed it over. He always went out first thing in the morning and first thing when he got home to refill a food bowl, and granted, the bowl was always empty when he did, but Nick had yet to see any sign of the animal that emptied it. "She's around," Vash said. "When it gets cold, she mostly lives in Mrs. Ellis's garage. There's a warm spot by the heater pipes. I, snuck in there and checked one time because I was worried." "Oh," Nick said, sipping scalding coffee. "Why doesn't she live in here?" Vash jerked a thumb at the living room and shook his head, swallowing a mouthful of coffee. "Would chew up everything," he said. "Knives' ultimatum?" But Vash shook his head again. "I don't want to coop an animal up in here either. Neither of us are home enough. We couldn't give it enough attention." He gestured to the outside door. "Kuroneko was here before us. She's just a community cat. No idea how old she is. Definitely over 10. Someone got her fixed years ago. I managed to take her to the vet once to get her spayed, but when they shaved her belly, she already had the little tattoo they put on there to show it's been done. And that was the last time I'll ever manage to bribe her into a cat carrier, let me tell you." Nick looked out the kitchen window into early morning sun, just starting to melt frost off the dead leaves of Vash's expired vegetable patch. "You sure she's okay?" he asked, frowning at the shrubbery that could be hiding all sorts of shit. Not to sound like a pile of horror movie cliches, but with some crazy asshole potentially hanging around. Vash nodded with grim understanding. "I know, but I've seen her around. I swear she's fine. Plus, I know she's just a cat, but she can take care of herself. Did I tell you how she actually clawed a finger off my last prosthetic?" And so the week ticked along. Nick had a hard time focusing on work, but he slogged through. Vash texted him more than usual, bored out of his mind on the other side of the street because there was almost nothing to do now that stock was nearly gone and there were only a handful of customers per day. Vash explained that he and Knives always closed the garden center the week before Christmas and didn't open to the public again until February, although the behind-the-scenes work picked up again before that. It gave them about a month of complete downtime every year, during which their tradition was to gradually descend into grouchy cabin fever madness and eventually stop talking to each other until the days started getting longer again. It was Vash's least favorite time of year for a whole host of reasons, of course, not least of which was that he ached constantly. He insisted that there was nothing not to love about having a hot boyfriend with a cool motorcycle, but still, Nick felt increasingly guilty about speeding Vash through freezing temperatures in the open air multiple times a day. Vash loaded up his right glove and both socks with little chemical warming packets and carried on gamely insisting he was fine, but Nick had seen the take-as-needed painkiller section of his medicine cabinet get a lot more use lately. None of the pain meds were narcotic, but they made Nick uneasy anyway. Knives was exactly as inscrutable as ever. He showed up to the garden center every day, did whatever mysterious nonsense he always did in the closed office, and was so tight-lipped about Elendira he might as well have been mute. Whenever Nick pressed Vash about it later, Vash just grimaced. "He's not telling me something," Vash finally admitted, 6 days after the fire at Red's Roses. "But I don't know what. All he'll say is that he's working on fixing it." "Don't like that," Nick muttered. "No," Vash agreed. But there wasn't anything to do about it except stew and anxieties, and since Vash was the most prone to that, Nick did his best to keep him distracted. Which was how they ended up at Strife and Thompson's Books, etc.'s alley door on Friday night, with a fifth of wild turkey and a big bag of ginger snaps as offerings to the gracious poker hostesses. Nick had finally reached a point where he recognized most everyone in the room, and they recognized him, and friendly barbs and chatter flowed freely. Millie was as much the life of the party as ever, and Nick caught Meryl beaming at him a couple of times, once even pointing at Vash and giving him a thumbs up. He rolled his eyes at her. Mary Ann the cop also showed up a little bit later, and when she saw Vash hanging on Nick's neck in some blatant PDA, she cried, "Don't tell me that other blonde you had your eye on was this dweeb!" Vash slid instantly into kick puppy persona and said, "My sweet, darling, beautiful Miss Mary Ann, whatever have I done to make you hate me so?" He staggered in her direction and started trying to wrap his arms around her, making smoochy faces. She yelped and smacked at him, trying to pull his ears and hair, but the way her face lit up suggested to Nick that whatever they had going on was more of an adopted little sister thing. It was cute, if a little disgusting. Nick thought he finally knew why Vash never got dealt into the actual poker game. because his prosthetic hand wasn't dexterous enough to manage a handful of cards. After the end of a round, he dragged Vash down to sit on the couch next to him and said, "Come here, Sunshine, we're a team." Vash beamed and threw his left arm around Nick's shoulders. It felt a little odd, all hard materials inside a cool sleeve unwarmed by body temperature, but it left Vash's right hand free. "Oh, you're going to regret that," Marianne said to Nick. And, oops. Nick rapidly realized that Vash's right hand alone was plenty dexterous enough to manage the cards, and that the reason he'd been semi-banned from playing had nothing to do with his physical ability and everything to do with how he played. Marianne dealt. Looking at the trash spread in Vash's hand, Nick murmured, "Fold." They'd put their heads extremely close together so that they could whisper moves to each other. Vash grinned and leaned in to whisper in Nick's ear, "Coward." His breath was sweet with orange and ginger sugar, and Nick had to resist a shiver. "Hey, ding-dongs, call or fold?" "Hold these," Vash said innocently, passing the cards to Nick. "Just want to get my drink." Vash picked up his bourbon, sipped with a sigh, and proceeded to play like an absolute maniac. He just sat there with his drink and declared moves that Nick then had to follow through since he was holding the cards. It took everything in Nick's power to keep his face neutral as Vash bet big on impossible turns and rivers, raised every single round, and went all in on a goddamn 7-3 offsuit flop that had zero hope of redemption. His face was unreadable, not because it was blank, but because his smile never changed. He cheerfully scared everyone off for 3 hands in a row. When he finally did have an 8-high straight to work with, he kept betting hard, but everyone else narrowed their eyes, assumed he was still bluffing, and tried to call it. The pot got dangerously huge. Everyone looked nervously around at each other. And when Vash finally grabbed the winning cards out of Nick's hand and slapped them onto the table with a whoop, a huge groan arose from the assembled. "I can't work in these conditions," Sandra from Bernardelli whined. From up the stairs, where she had gone to gather more snacks, Millie shouted, "Is someone letting Mr. Vash play again?" Meryl cackled. As soon as Nick had been dealt in, she'd cashed out and had just been watching. Marianne pointed at Nick and said, "Damn it, I thought you being here might make things different." Nick raised an eyebrow, deadpan as ever. "You can see what he's doing back there. How are you keeping a straight face?" "Sorry," said Nick. "Are we playing poker or not?" Vash laughed like a madman. He swept up all the cards, cut the deck, and did a one-handed shuffle. Nick's immaculate poker face thankfully also prevented anyone else from knowing how fucking hot he'd found that. "Who wants some more?" Vash asked gleefully. Eventually, Nick did take back control of his cards, mainly to prevent the entire game from breaking down. Nick played with calm, considered strategy, and he won and lost in about equal measure. Vash explained, much too close to Nick's ear, that the secret to his success was that he didn't care if he won or not, so nothing he did actually mattered. This, finally, made Nick's smooth facade crack. He twitched with overwhelming empathy for the other players at the table, and swore never to try to play cards against Vash in the future. He was a loose cannon of the most dire degree. Every now and then, Vash would lean still in and whisper a suggestion. Finally, Nick turned and whispered back, "You better stop putting that mouth on my ear unless you're going to make good." Vash smirked. The next time he leaned in as if to offer advice, he held his hand up as though to block the sound and proceeded to lick right at the shell of Nick's ear. Nick, who was trying to shuffle, nearly jumped out of his skin. "You two are disgusting," Meryl told them. Literally everyone leapt at the chance to enumerate the dozens upon dozens of times Meryl had been disgustingly cute with Millie in front of God and everyone. Meryl got redder and redder and eventually was rendered completely nonverbal by Millie picking her up, setting her on her lap, and calling her my pocket wife. Vash laughed so hard he eventually had to excuse himself to go recover, because he'd apparently exacerbated his old aches. After one more hand of poker, Nick bowed out to go check on him. Vash hadn't gone up the back stairs, so Nick had to venture out into the maze of bookshelves in the shop part of the building. The downstairs bathroom was empty, the shadows between shelves deep and dark. Rowdy laughter and yelling still carried out from the game room, but it was muffled by furniture as Nick moved further away. At length he thought to glance up, and spotted a small light in the upstairs balcony portion of the bookstore. He wound his way to the stairs. The plastic chain that blocked the way up had been clipped off to one side. Nick started up the steps. He hadn't spent much time in the store portion of S&T, and he certainly hadn't been up here before. It didn't look much from downstairs at a single glance, but he paused to take in a few titles and covers that were turned to face outward. Yeah, this was the spicy section for sure. He rolled his eyes fondly at the cover art of an old bodice ripper, done in that ancient-looking oil painting style. Fabio in a ripped-up pirate shirt, a brunette with a heaving bosom, sprays of roses. Some kids at the orphanage, not including Nick, thankfully, had once discovered Miss Melanie's very limited stash of dime store romances like these, and she'd practically steamed from the ears. But the more he walked down the line and looked, the less mainstream the subject matter got. There were labels up here just like downstairs, but these ranged from as tame-sounding as Amish romance to as comprehensively racy as queer BDSM, to as mystifyingly arcane as ABO. Nick turned one of those around to look at the cover, and it did not clarify anything. Some small, twinkish person in artfully torn clothes, hands clasped protectively over a big baby bump, was kneeling at the feet of a mountain of muscle bearing a set of animalistic sharp teeth. Nick hurriedly put it back and shook his head. He liked to think of himself as worldly, but part of that was knowing when to just walk away and leave other people to their kinks in peace. As he walked on, another shelf label caught his eye. Religious. He expected art of comically sexy nuns, but was not prepared for one of the outfacing covers to be of a relatively dark-complected priest, looking up longingly at a painting of an ethereally beautiful male angel reaching out of the bounds of the frame towards him. Nick's mouth went dry. He looked away quickly, thinking, other people's kinks, yeah, right. The light was coming from a lamp over in the comics and magazines section. Vash was sprawled on the floor, his back against a shelf, flipping through a slim paperback comic book that had that lower-quality, self-published look about it. Nick stopped next to Vash, looking down at him. Vash blithely carried on reading. "What you got?" Nick finally asked. Vash hummed. "A prisoner of war Roman gladiator plotting how to escape the arena, making friends with the other fighters and stuff. It's good." Nick leaned down to see the page Vash was on. "Yeah," Nick said dryly. "Making good friends, looks like." "Nah, this is the senator who's taken a special interest in the main character," Vash drawled, flipping the page to further abuses of olive oil in ancient Roman bath settings. "Looks very focused on plot." Vash snickered, turning his head to the side to look at an angled panel. He could have just turned the book. There was pink high in his cheeks, but Nick thought that had more to do with the amount of bourbon he'd consumed than the number of dicks he was looking at. "I'm getting ideas," Vash said, finger tracing over an ancient Roman bubble butt. "Yeah? Taking notes?" "Mm-hmm." "This your subtle way of telling me you want to leave?" "No." Vash hummed, turning the page again. "Keep on pokering. It's fine with me." Nick reached down and plucked the comic out of Vash's hands. He idly flipped through it, leaning on a shelf, and had to admit that it gave him a few ideas too. Next to him, Vash scrambled to his feet with a protest. "Give that back, or you'll—" Vash snapped the book right back out of Nick's hands and tucked it onto a shelf, not looking to see if it was in the right spot. "What do you think, Orile?" Nick wrapped his arms around Vash's waist, leaned close, and said, "I don't know, be an insufferable tease?" Vash huffed. "Oh, I'm the insufferable tease," he said, hovering his mouth near Nick's without touching. "Aren't you?" Nick leaned over and caught Vash's earring in his teeth, sucked gently at his earlobe. He discovered that Vash was delightfully weak against that move, and had wondered aloud before why Vash only had the one piercing. To which Vash had complained, "I didn't know it was going to be a freaking erogenous zone when I got it, damn it. I just thought it looked cool." Vash went kind of weak-jointed and sagged like he always did when Nick went at his ears, but he also slid his right hand down the back of Nick's pants for a shameless grope. Nick made an approving noise and went right on necking. "You know you're the tease, bastard," Vash said breathlessly. "I said, hey, slow down once, and it's like your vocation now." "Oh, I'm sorry," Nick said, pulling Vash's hips flush to his. "Is there an orgasm quota I'm falling behind on or something? Last time I checked, I am pretty much physically incapable of saying no to you." Vash's attempt at a hard-ass attitude melted, and he ducked his face into Nick's neck, giggling. "No," he groaned, pushing Nick gently back against the shelf and making a few books wobble precariously. "Come on, you know what I'm talking about." Nick moved his hands to Vash's hips and stopped him. "I actually don't," he said, more seriously this time. Vash pulled back and looked at him, sea-green eyes a little wide. "What?" Nick gave him a pointed frown. Vash's blush got darker, finally due to embarrassment more than alcohol. "I thought you were just, saving it still." "Saving what?" Vash's eyelid twitched. "Oh my God, I'll kill you." What? Something pinged in the back of Nick's mind. Wait, saving... Remember? Nick bumped his head backwards and gave a despairing groan. Vash, you have to ask for these things with words. You mean you forgot? Yeah, I forgot. Nick pinched Vash's arm. It's not everybody's cup of tea, you know. You kept not going there, so I kept not going there. It's all... good times were being had regardless. Vash gave a helpless laugh and dropped his face to Nick's shoulder. Fucking hell, he mumbled. Right? Right what? Good times, right? Enjoying all around? Not just being frustrated with me and not saying anything for, several nights, to say the least. Nick, said Vash, and shut him up with a heady, open-mouthed kiss. Nick leaned into it, the hot slide of tongue and ginger bourbon heat, Vash's body pressed to his, warm through clothes. Vash made small sounds in his throat, moved his hand around to the front of Nick's pants, found his cock through the material and rubbed it, encouraging. Nick grunted and turned his face to the side. Fuck, Spiky, speaking of slowing down, maybe? Vash squeezed his handful and made a needy noise. Yes, Nick gasped, but I have to drive and you're making it difficult. Vash snickered, but he let go, dragging his hand up Nick's chest beneath his shirt instead. How drunk are you? Nick asked. Not very, Nick said. He kissed Nick quickly. Little buzzed. Get ready to sober up quick, bud. It's cold out there. Ugh. Vash thumped his head against Nick's shoulder again. I don't wanna, he said, muffled. Nick patted him on the back, the mood successfully killed enough to allow them to get themselves sorted out. It took some unsexy thoughts and some hurried adjustments, but Nick managed to make himself slightly less scandalous before he headed down the stairs. Vash, on the other hand, could not have been more obviously flushed pink and disheveled when he walked back into the game room, where the poker game was going strong. Meryl was back in, and she was dominating. Millie was whooping and cheering on her every move, toasting the air with her beer bottle. Someone whistled at Vash. Meryl looked around in time to see the cat who got the cream grin on Vash's face and a slightly guilty look on Nick, as she jumped to her own inevitable conclusions. In front of the books? Really? She said, dismayed. I haven't done anything, Nick said defensively. Yet, Vash called, already across the room and hunting for his coat among the pile of guests' cold weather gear. Are you leaving already? Millie asked, getting up so she could throw her arms around Nick's neck. She always got her minimum 3 hugs per visit, come hell or high water. He hugged her back. Yep, big girl, I've got an appointment elsewhere. Vash popped up next to both of them, coat on, and said, I'm the appointment. But you're right here. Solemnly, Vash said, I'll explain when you're older. And Millie burst out laughing. On the couch behind them, even Meryl had to giggle. Millie co-owned an erotica store. Her sweet, childlike personality hid some alarmingly well-educated depths. Millie hugged both of them again, and a chorus of goodbyes and good nights and well wishes followed them to the back door. As soon as they were outside, the cold hit like a backhanded bitch slap from hell. It had been windy all day, and the gusts had only picked up intensity after nightfall. Once again, Nick felt miserably guilty as he handed Vash his helmet. The man's teeth were already chattering, his eyes tightened into a constant flinch. Damn it, he thought. I should just trade in for a car. The helmets at least created bubbles of relative warmth during an otherwise shitty drive back to Vash's house. Getting there and getting inside was all hustle, no pausing to talk. The interior was nice and warm, but Vash went straight to the radiator anyway, sucking up any and all heat he could get. Nick stripped out of his own coat, scarf, and gloves, but Vash stayed huddled in his. Nick grabbed a blanket off the back of the couch and came up behind him with it. He bundled it over Vash's shoulders and then wrapped himself over that, taking Vash's hands in his and pulling his right glove off. Nick's hands were always warm, Vash's always icy by comparison. Vash let out a shuddering sigh as Nick worked circulation into his fingers. Hey, Nick said over his shoulder. That card trick? Incredibly sexy, by the way. Vash let out a startled laugh. It's not a trick, he said. That's just my shuffle. Bullshit. That stuff's hard to learn. A lot's hard to learn to do with one hand, Vash said, still grinning. I just have the benefit of not being able to be lazy about practicing. Oh, the benefit, he says, Nick said. His practical, vigorous rubbing of Vash's hand had turned into more of a caress by now. He pressed his thumb into Vash's palm, circling it around. The privilege of being incredible, resilient. He pushed down the back of the blanket with his chin, just barely getting some access to Vash's neck, which he kissed. Smart as hell, skilled as hell, fucking unfairly gorgeous, he went on. Vash squirmed against him. Nick could see how red he was blushing just from the back of his neck. "Stop it," Vash complained. "Nope," Nick told him. "Never." Vash huffed. Nick kept hold of his hand, but moved his own left hand over to the task of opening Vash's coat. "Did you have something you wanted to ask me about, by the way?" Nick said, all innocence. Vash gave a breathless laugh. "Bastard." Nick got the coat open and moved on to Vash's shirt. He only worked open the bottom couple of buttons before sliding his warm palm onto Vash's stomach. "Warming up?" "Fuck you," Vash laughed, rolling his hips back. There were way too many layers of coat and blanket for it to actually get any friction where it needed to be, but Nick pressed into it anyway. "Absolutely an option," Nick informed Vash, to which Vash made a strangled sound and turned in his arms, all but attacking Nick with a kiss. The blanket fell partly on the heater. Nick had the presence of mind to hurriedly kick it out of the way so the house didn't burn down, but past that, he was altogether too occupied to bother with rational thoughts. He worked open the rest of Vash's shirt while stumbling back, guided to the couch by a boyfriend who at least knew his own living room well enough to keep both of them from tripping over a table full of plants. Nick's knees hit the couch and he sat down hard, Vash falling into his lap in a less than comfortable heap. The indignity faded immediately in favor of a rushed struggle to get clothes off. Vash was still chilly to the touch, but it didn't take much attention from Nick's hands and mouth to get his skin to start flushing warm all over. "I don't want," Vash tried, driven to distraction by Nick's tongue on his nipple. Fuck, yeah, okay." "Don't want?" Nick asked, drawing back long enough to get Vash's pants open. "I wanna fuck," Vash squeaked out, as Nick got his hand down into Vash's underwear and eased his warm palm over Vash's half-hard cock. "I did figure that much out," Nick said. "You are," Vash said into the side of his neck, "too smug to live." Nick sucked lightly on his earlobe, and Vash went all boneless and shivery in his lap. "You want," he prompted again. "Want to fuck," Vash grated out. "Fuck me, for God's sake." Nick kept working his cock lightly and asked, "Have you ever done that before?" It only took a moment for Vash to say, "No, He trailed off into a shuddery moan. "It's fine," Nick hurried to reassure him. "That wasn't judging." "Better not be," Vash said, hips jerking out of his control. "You are not helping me use my words right now," he added. Sorry. Nick withdrew his hand and held Vash's waist. Vash made a faint noise of complaint, but he fell back to the task of getting Nick shirtless the moment he wasn't too distracted. After a couple of minutes, they were surrounded by a nest of shed clothes and back to no more than heady making out. Nick smoothed a palm over one of the harness straps across Vash's chest. In a break for air, he asked, "Can I?" "Huh?" Vash finally noticed that Nick's hand was straying close to the harness's clasp. His eyes went momentarily wide, almost a flash of panic, and Nick stopped moving. "Hey, I won't." Nick moved his hand up to Vash's neck instead. "Sorry, I won't." "No, I mean," Vash blinked at him. "What were you doing?" "Taking it off?" Nick asked, furrowing his brow. An odd, still moment of quiet descended between them. Vash looked at him with an expression of stunned vulnerability, and all Nick could do was hold on and pray that Vash could see somewhere in Nick's face all the unconditional love and lust and support and care and just everything, really. Vash swallowed and said, "Yeah, you can." Without breaking eye contact, Nick moved his hand back to the harness clasp. It wasn't complicated. He unhooked it by feel, and the straps went slack across Vash's chest. Between them, they levered the prosthetic arm off. It fell with a light thump on top of wadded shirts and coats that were definitely going to be wrinkled as hell tomorrow. It wasn't really heavy, but it seemed like Vash was noticeably lighter without it. Nick rubbed gently over the pink lines the pressure of the straps left in Vash's skin. "You good, Spiky?" Nick asked, trying to keep his tone light. Yes. Vash swallowed. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Good." Nick pulled him down into another long kiss. After a bit, he said, "Not to be a buzzkill, but even if we're doing this on the couch, I gotta go get some stuff." Vash snorted. We're not doing it on the couch." then you gotta let me get up someday. Vash heaved an exaggerated sigh, but pushed himself to his feet and held out his hand to pull Nick up. Down the hall, Vash disappeared into the bathroom with a murmured promise to be right back. In Vash's bedroom, Nick pulled his travel bag out from the corner where it had already gotten buried under half-unpacked things, and found the inside pocket where he'd shoved some just-in-case supplies. He was pretty well acquainted with the contents of Vash's bedside table by now, so he knew that even though Vash wanted this, he wasn't exactly prepared for it. He'd just gotten the covers pulled back and supplies piled on the bedside table when the bedroom door closed and Vash pressed up behind him, arms around his waist, hands sliding down the front of his pants. Okay. Nick laughed at him. Impatient? I've been waiting for a while, Vash said pointedly, pressing his hand up Nick's length. The low simmer of arousal that had been flickering in Nick's belly since the bookstore started to ramp up now that they were in a place where something could actually be done about it. Nick put his head back on Vash's shoulder and enjoyed the insistent touch for a moment longer, heat pulling under his skin, breath picking up. Refuse to take the blame for that, Nick said, half smiling. Could have asked. Any time. Vash nosed against his ear and kissed his neck. But you were so sweet, he said, cloyingly sweet himself. Let's save some firsts for later. I give, it's fucking later, okay? Nick said, hips bucking into Vash's hand. Shit, at least let me get my pants off. Vash helped him, which was less than helpful, but Nick finally managed to strip off. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed and tugged Vash forward by the hips, already working on his fly. What are you... Vash bit his lip and strangled on his cry, hands flying to Nick's hair as Nick went straight to work sucking his cock. He had such a pretty one, cut and smooth, easy for Nick to fit his mouth around. His body hair was all nearly as fine and silky as his blonde mop, too, nice to run fingers through and make Vash shudder, scooting up onto the mattress with one knee to get closer to Nick's mouth. This, Vash gasped, was not the plan. Nick let him go with a small pop. I never heard a whole plan, he said. You gonna let me in on it? He looked up at Vash from beneath his unruly black bangs while he deliberately took the head of Vash's cock back into his mouth and sucked it firm and slow. Vash glared down at him, brushed Nick's hair back from his face, and rocked his hip gently forward, making Nick take more. Nick gave an encouraging hum and let Vash slowly figure out how to fuck his mouth, shallowly enough so that Nick didn't choke. Vash tried, but had to stop and swallow hard, red-faced. Shit. The plan involves your cock in my ass, you unreasonable cretin. He bit his lip. He felt dangerously hard on Nick's tongue, cock twitching every now and then with restraint. Nick slid off and breathed deep, lips swollen and wet. He licked the bottom one and dragged Vash's pants the rest of the way down. Get on the bed, he said. Vash followed orders immediately, kicking his jeans off to the side and half crawling on top of Nick to get past him, to get situated. Nick turned with him, held his thighs and climbed on top, ducking back down for another quick taste of Vash's cock. Vash bucked up, moaning, startled. Close already? Nick asked. Shut up, Vash said, breathless. No, it's good. Want to make this good. Nick moved up Vash's body and kissed him, slotting neatly between the legs Vash spread for him, links rubbing together. I'm seriously not trying to talk you out of anything here, okay? Nick said, brushing hair off Vash's forehead and nipping down his jaw. But this isn't everyone's thing. If you don't like it, you gotta tell me. Nick, Vash groaned. I have some fingers left, okay? I already know I like it. Nick's brain shorted out. He was dumbstruck by the mental image of Vash fingering himself. Oh, hell, he had such long and clever fingers, too, and he was so bendy he could probably get deep. Probably already knew his prostate like an old friend. Nick made a strangled noise and grabbed over at the bedside table for lube while Vash laughed at him. Vash already had lube, yes, but it was water-based, easy on, easy off, good for the simple stuff. The small bottle Nick had brought with him was a different beast, silicone and thick. He got a dollop out and tried to give it a chance to warm on his fingers before he nudged Vash's legs wider and his hips up, leaned over to kiss him, and slicked his fingertips firmly over Vash's hole. Vash jerked a little against him, needy sounds against Nick's mouth. His right hand roamed Nick's back and neck and shoulders, fingers pressing into pressure points, sending nerve-tingling cascading down Nick's spine as he worked one finger inside and then two, and tried not to think too hard about how tight it was, how hungry Vash's moans were, the heat around his fingers and the heat spiking in his stomach. Another generous squeeze of lube and 3 fingers deep. Nick cursed against Vash's neck, and Vash said, Yeah, come on, I can. Nick wasn't sure he could, actually, with how tight he still felt. But Nick wasn't that crazy well endowed, so a decent amount of time relaxing around 3 fingers was probably enough. Nick worked him open for another minute, found his prostate, stroked it. Vash gave an intense shudder and whine, threw his arm over his head to grab at the slats of the headboard. "Okay," Nick told him. "Okay." He sat up, reached over and found a condom, managed to tear it open without fumbling it. Little lube in the tip, roll it on, more on the outside. He held it to his base and squeezed and tried to think about every boner killer he could, but nothing worked. The sight of a flushed and sweaty Vash all spread out beneath him, begging to be fucked, was too much. Damn it, he just hoped this wasn't going to be 90 seconds or less. He pressed in slow, met no resistance. Vash got louder, sucked in moans on his inhales, startled little sounds of pleasure verging on alarm. Fuck, stop, hang on, Vash yelped when Nick was almost in all the way. Nick held his waist and pulled back a little, easing Vash's hips up, shifting his weight. "I've got you," he said, heart pounding. "Hurts?" "No," Vash whimpered. He reached down and cupped himself hard, pinching at his base. Nope, opposite problem." Nick couldn't help laughing at him, breathless. He sat up a bit, looped an arm under Vash's thigh, found the inside of Vash's raised knee and kissed it. "Yeah, this might not last too long," he said. Damn it," Vash moaned, rolling his head back. "Don't care. Okay. We're doing this as much as humanly possible from now on." "Hey, I might want to turn sometimes," Nick said teasingly, and Vash made another strangled noise. Not helping me keep it under control here," Vash complained. Nick eased out and back in, slow as he could manage. "Then don't," he said, and rolled his hips again, firmer now, bottoming out. Vash was always vocal, but he got gratifyingly loud as Nick finally set a steady pace. His face was adorably red, and he kept biting his lip until Nick doubled over again to kiss him because he didn't want Vash to straight up bite through his lip, but of course as soon as he did that, Vash just bit at Nick's mouth instead. Nick had to try not to focus on how fucking incredible Vash felt around him. So tight and hot it was almost too much. So good that all Nick could do was hold on, snap his hips, and wonder how high this plateau could possibly get before he fell off the edge. Vash's moans got choppier, gasps like he was drowning, and Nick propped himself on one arm so he could reach between them, push Vash's hand out of the way, and work his painfully hard cock for a few last strokes before Vash came with a cry, grabbing the top of Nick's shoulder and digging his fingers in hard. Vash clenched around him, and Nick all but whited out, seeing stars as the pleasure peaked and plummeted. He had no control over his hips as he quaked through a climax that had been all evening in the making. He came back into focus a few seconds later, to Vash kissing the side of his mouth and half panting, half laughing. He gathered his wits enough to try to kiss back, but the easy laughter of shared hysteria was contagious, and he ended up with his forehead to Vash's, trying to catch his breath while every lick of tension unspooled from his body. "Yeah, good?" he finally managed, and Vash just snorted another laugh. "No, it's terrible," Vash said, a little slurred. "Fuck you," Nick laughed, and gingerly eased out, holding the condom. Vash winced a bit, hissed between his teeth, but as soon as Nick gave him space, he slumped down bonelessly, chest rising and falling with deep, long breaths, eyes sliding half-closed. A few used tissues later, Nick blearily slapped at the foot of the bed for the covers and hauled them up. Vash was already on his side, arm stump wedged under his pillow, ready to cling to Nick like a heat-seeking limpet with every other limb as soon as Nick settled down beside him. His back was tacky with drying, cooling sweat. Nick dragged his knuckles up the small of Vash's spine, and Vash shivered and snuggled closer. Vash finally mumbled, "I think I'm going to be sore tomorrow." Nick snorted against his hair. "You're definitely going to be sore tomorrow, Spiky." "You're not allowed to feel bad," Vash said sleepily. "Excuse me?" "For hurting me." Nick pinched his brows. "Did I?" "No," Vash groaned. "Wake up and make some sense, please." Nick patted Vash's cheek. Vash cracked his eyes open and pouted. "I'm not planning on feeling bad about this," Nick told him. "So what the hell are you talking about?" Vash sighed. He searched for words for a moment, then said, "I might hurt some, but I got to choose it. I wanted it, so no guilt." It clicked. Nick's heart did a funny offbeat, and he squeezed Vash closer. "Hey, okay," he said. "Don't worry. It wouldn't have even occurred to me to feel guilty." Vash gave him a sleepy grin. "Good." Nick nuzzled his temple. "You have," he said. The most perfect ass. Vash giggled faintly. Gonna treat it right from now on. Mm-hmm. Assume you haven't been eaten out before? Vash jerked. Jesus, he said, muffled by covers. Nick hummed happily, patted Vash's side, and said, Go to sleep, Spiky. There's always tomorrow. Vash whined faintly into his pillow, but Nick could see the edge of his smile.